The desert does not forgive hesitation. Cole Harmon had learned that truth in places that don't appear on any map a civilian would recognize, in narrow corridors where the air tasted of concrete dust and old fire, where the margin between a decision and its consequence measured itself not in seconds but in fractions of them. He had carried that lesson home the way soldiers carry most things, quietly, without ceremony, pressed flat against the inside of his chest, where it couldn't be seen from the outside. But tonight was not overseas. Tonight was Copper Ridge, Nevada, population 4,000 and shrinking. And the only fire was the one his neighbor, Mrs. Adeline Cross, kept burning in her backyard pit on cool evenings. The orange glow visible through the fence slats, like a distant signal from a world still interested in warmth. Cole sat on the back step of his rental house at 11:15 at night, a glass of water resting on the ground beside his boot, untouched. The desert around Copper Ridge had released the day's heat in slow degrees, and now the air carried a faint mineral coolness that suggested the Mojave had not entirely forgotten what nighttime was supposed to feel like. Stars scattered themselves across the black sky with the indifferent generosity of things that owe nothing to anyone. He was not thinking about stars. He was thinking about a threshold. Specifically, he was thinking about the threshold of a crumbling compound in a place he had no intention of naming even inside his own mind, and the way Rex had paused at it. Not stopped, paused. There was a difference that mattered more than Cole had been able to explain to anyone, since including the counselor at the VA, who had listened with the patient, practiced expression of someone trained to receive difficult information without flinching. Rex had been 4 years old, a working-line German shepherd, with a black saddle and tan legs, and amber eyes that caught light the way certain old glass catches it, holding it briefly before letting it pass through. He had weighed 82 pounds and moved with the quiet, self-contained efficiency of an animal bred not for show rings but for purpose. For 2 years he had walked at Cole's left side through environments that would have unmade a lesser creature, and in that time the language between them had compressed itself down to gesture, posture, breath, communication that didn't require words because it had moved beyond them. At that threshold, Rex had paused. His body had shifted almost imperceptibly, the subtle stiffening along the spine that Cole had learned to read the way other men read weather, not as certainty, but as warning. And Cole had been a fraction of a second behind the signal, his hand already rising toward the command that would have held Rex in position when Rex made the decision for both of them and moved forward. The explosion that followed had been loud enough to alter the way Cole experienced sound for 3 weeks afterward. Rex had not survived it. Cole had. That arithmetic had occupied every quiet moment of the past 22 months, and the desert night offered plenty of quiet moments to fill. He picked up the water glass, drank half of it, set it back down, and looked out at the dark yard where nothing moved. Tomorrow, Sandra Keel, who managed commercial properties across 4 counties and communicated primarily through brief, functional phone calls, had scheduled him for an electrical repair job at an abandoned solar energy facility on the western edge of town. Unstable fluctuations in remaining operational lines. The kind of work that required attention without demanding conversation, which was the only kind of work Cole had accepted since moving to Copper Ridge 9 months earlier. He went inside at midnight. He did not sleep well. He rarely did. The drive to the facility carried Cole west along a road that thinned from 2 lanes to 1 and eventually surrendered entirely to gravel, the landscape opening around him into wide emptiness that either settled a person or unsettled them further, depending on what they'd brought with them. Cole had brought his tools, his water jug, and 22 months of unresolved guilt. He did not consider this an unusual load. The facility appeared ahead in pieces. First, the rows of solar panels angled toward the sky like dark mirrors, their surfaces dulled by accumulated sand and a season without maintenance. Then the main control shed, low and rectangular, paint curling at its edges, where the sun had worked on it patiently and without mercy. Then the secondary warehouse structure further back, corrugated metal walls that shimmered in the heat, as though the building itself were breathing. He parked on the gravel apron and stepped out into air that hit him like the opening of an oven door, dry and immediate and deeply serious. Even through the soles of his work boots, he could feel the heat stored in the ground beneath the desert's long memory of the morning sun still radiating upward. He adjusted his work shirt, rolled the sleeves to the forearm as a concession to practicality rather than comfort, and carried his tool bag toward the control shed. The wiring inside was exactly the kind of problem he had anticipated. Aging insulation connections, oxidized by temperature cycles, a main breaker assembly that had developed the erratic behavior of machinery left too long without attention. Cole worked methodically as he always did, each action deliberate and unhurried. He had learned early in his Navy career that methodical work was its own form of discipline, that hands occupied doing something precise kept the mind from wandering into territory that served no operational purpose. He was tightening a connection on the secondary bus bar when he heard it. The sound was thin and irregular, riding the edge of audibility against the background of wind moving through the panel arrays and the faint metallic ticking of the shed's walls expanding in the heat. It came and went twice before Cole lifted his head. Not sharply, not with alarm, but with the quiet, trained attention of a man who had learned to differentiate between the sounds that meant nothing and the sounds that meant everything. He set down his tool and listened. The sound came again. A broken whimper, thin as wire, pulled too tight and unmistakably alive. Cole crossed the gravel yard with even strides, moving around the corner of the warehouse structure toward its sun-facing side. And what arranged itself before him in the flat white glare of midday stopped him for a moment in a way that very little stopped him anymore. The dog lay stretched along the thin boundary where the warehouse's narrow strip of shade ended and the direct sun began. It was a German shepherd, young, perhaps 8 months old, still growing into the proportions its frame promised, with large paws and the beginning of the muscle structure that its breeding had designed for endurance. The coat was black and tan, dulled by dust and dehydration. The ribs faintly visible in the kind of definition that spoke not of fitness but of inadequate nutrition over time. A length of chain ran from a bolt set in the warehouse wall to a steel collar around the dog's neck. The chain was short, deliberately, purposefully short, the kind of length that kept the animal within a radius, that offered no choices about where to position itself in relation to the sun. Even with the dog's body fully extended, its shoulders remained in direct sunlight. The only shade fell inches beyond the reach of the chain's end, as precisely and completely unavailable as if it had been placed there by calculation. The water bowl lay overturned in the dirt, empty and dry and hot to the touch. The collar had worked against the dog's neck until the fur there had thinned, and the skin beneath had gone angry and pink. Not fresh damage, but accumulated abrasion that developed over days of the same wearing pressure. Cole moved slowly toward the animal. his posture low and unhurried, palm open at his side, in the instinctive gesture of approach he had used 1,000 times beside a different dog in very different circumstances. The shepherd's ears lifted weakly, not erect, the muscles too depleted for that, but responsive, the tips rising slightly as his boots crossed gravel. The dog did not growl. It did not bark. It watched him come with eyes clouded by dehydration, but not by fear. And when he crouched within reach, it released a single low sound, not a whimper exactly, more a breath shaped into communication, and shifted its muzzle fractionally toward his hand. Cole rested his palm against the side of the dog's head and felt the heat stored in that dark fur. Dangerous heat, the kind that cooked organs from the inside, while the exterior appeared merely warm to an inattentive observer. "Easy," he said quietly. A single word calibrated by long habit, low, steady, stripped of anything that could be interpreted as urgency or threat. The shepherd went still beneath his hand with an immediacy that was not the stillness of exhaustion. It was the trained stillness of a working dog responding to a familiar command structure. The precise quiet an animal produced when it recognized not a specific voice, but a specific register. The register of someone who knew how to speak that language. Cole stayed in his crouch for a long moment, his hand resting lightly against the dog's head, and felt something cold move through him, despite the 110-degree air. A dog thrown on a chain for deterrence didn't respond to a stranger's low voice like that. A dog bred for intimidation didn't lie with that kind of patience. Beneath its exhaustion didn't meet a stranger's eyes with that steady, undemanding attention. This was an animal shaped by structured work, by repetition and reward, and the discipline of someone who understood what working dogs were built to do. Cole looked at the deliberately shortened chain, at the overturned bowl, at the worn groove in the dirt where the dog had circled repeatedly within its confined radius over days, looking for shade that was always just beyond reach. He felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 22 months, settle into the cavity behind his sternum, like a coal finding a draft. He unhooked the clasp from the bolted ring with steady hands. He filled his hard hat from the gallon water jug he kept in the truck for desert work, a habit formed not from luxury, but from operational experience in hot environments, and brought it back to where the dog lay, tilting it carefully, so that water reached the dry tongue without flooding a system too stressed to handle volume. The shepherd drank in uneven pulls, desperation regulated by the body's instinctive self-preservation. And after the second minute, leaned forward against Cole's chest with a slow, deliberate weight that was not aggression and not the demanding lean of an untrained animal seeking food. It was relief. The simple, eloquent weight of a creature that had been holding everything alone for too long and had finally found something solid to rest against. Cole felt the tremor running through the dog's body, the low, persistent vibration of an overtaxed system still managing its crisis, and adjusted his arm around the shepherd's chest. Without thinking about it, the motion as automatic as breathing. Up close, the picture clarified in ways that tightened something at the base of his throat, faint linear scarring along the flank. Not from this confinement, older damage healed imperfectly and without care. A wound near the left rear leg that had closed on its own, without treatment, leaving a hardened ridge of scar tissue. The pattern of fur loss around the neck extending beyond what the chain alone would have caused. suggesting the collar had been on for far longer than the duration of whatever this assignment had been. This was not one bad day. This was a practice. He ran careful fingers along the shepherd's spine, noting the muscle tone that remained. Despite dehydration, the frame of an animal that had been something before it had been reduced to this. Strong genetics. Working line conformation. He recognized it the way a person who has spent time around a particular thing recognizes its absence when they find it in degraded form. What are you? He thought, not aloud. What were you before this? He heard the truck before he saw it. Tires on gravel, the sound of a heavy-duty pickup moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who considered a given piece of ground to be his own. Cole rose slowly, placing himself between the dog and the approaching vehicle with the unconscious precision of someone for whom the spatial geometry of protection was second nature. The man who stepped out was broad across the middle, the kind of bulk that suggested physical work in an earlier life now maintained primarily by stubbornness. 50 or near enough not to matter sandy hair thinning and pressed back from a flushed face that carried the permanent high color of a man who spent too much time in direct sun and not enough time regulating his temper. He wore a short-sleeve work shirt with the top 2 buttons open and jeans that had seen real use, and he walked toward Cole with the gait of someone accustomed to arriving at situations already owning them. Cole looked at the face approaching across that gravel yard and experienced the specific disorienting phenomenon of recognition arriving before context, the moment when a face produced a name before the memory that contained the name had fully surfaced. He had seen that face before, not in Copper Ridge, and not in any context that belonged to this yard or this desert. He had seen it across a procurement table at a forward operating base outside Kandahar in 2019. Boyd Crane listed in the contractor manifest as a civilian logistics specialist present for a supply chain review that had subsequently produced 3 separate inquiries into missing equipment, specifically communication hardware and portable generator units that had been signed out to forward positions and had never arrived. The inquiries had generated paperwork and bureaucratic correspondence for 11 months. They had produced no charges. Crane had departed the theater on schedule, collected his fees, and gone home. The equipment had not been recovered. Cole looked at the chain lying in the dirt and understood with the bone-deep clarity of a man who had spent years connecting the visible to the obscured, that some men traveled the same circuit, regardless of geography. Different inventory, same method, same fundamental conviction that the system's attention could always be redirected elsewhere with enough patience and the right connections in place. "That's my dog," Boyd said while still 15 feet out, voice carrying the practiced edge of someone who deployed it as a first tool rather than a last resort. His eyes dropped to the unhooked chain lying in the dirt beside Cole's boot, and his jaw tightened with the specific tension of a man who has arrived to find something already altered in his absence. "What in the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" Cole did not raise his voice. He had learned over years of managing situations that ranged from tense to genuinely lethal that the most useful thing a controlled voice could do was force another person to stop and recalibrate. It was a form of leverage that cost nothing and was rarely recognized for what it was. "He can't reach the shade," Cole said. He let the statement stand without elaboration, gesturing with a slight tilt of his chin toward the geometry of the chain, the overturned bowl, the worn dirt. "And his water's been gone a while. Boyd dismissed this with a wave of his hand. The gesture of a man signaling an argument doesn't merit engagement, rather than a man who actually finds it trivial. He's a guard dog. He's supposed to stay put. A pause, then the addition that Cole had expected. Heat doesn't bother them the way it bothers city types. Cole looked at the man for a moment without speaking. Boyd Crane was sweating through his shirt. The temperature was 111 degrees. The irony didn't seem to register. You can't come onto my property and start cutting restraints. Boyd stepped closer, the move designed to assert proximity as authority. That's trespassing. Cole didn't step back. And then he became aware of a second presence at the edge of the yard. She was standing beside the open passenger door of Boyd's truck, and she was perhaps 11 years old. Slender in the way children sometimes became when stress had reorganized the relationship between appetite and eating. Long brown hair that had escaped its ponytail at the sides and framed a face that held a seriousness that didn't belong to 11 but had arrived there anyway, deposited by circumstances that didn't check age requirements at the door. She was wearing a faded t-shirt with a desert sunset printed across the front, and sneakers that were slightly too large, and her posture was the posture of a person who had been practicing invisibility for long enough that it had become structural. Shoulders curved slightly inward. Weight shifted back. The unconscious body language of someone who had learned that taking up less space correlated with encountering less danger. Sadie Crane. Cole would learn her name later. For now, she was simply the child standing at the edge of this yard, with an expression that contained more information than any of Boyd's words had. She was not looking at her father. She was looking at the dog. Her eyes moved from the shepherd to Cole and back to the shepherd, with a careful intensity that spoke of familiarity, not the curiosity of someone encountering a situation for the first time, but the constrained anguish of someone who had encountered it repeatedly and had lacked either the means or the permission to change it. There was apology in that look directed not at Cole, but at the animal, as though she owed the dog something she hadn't been able to pay. When her gaze met Cole's for a fraction of a second before dropping away, he read what was there with the same clarity he had once read, the terrain of environments where reading clearly was a survival skill. He had seen that look before, not in the desert and not on a child. On men in extremis who had not yet lost hope but who were running calculations about whether hope was still a rational investment. He turned back to Boyd. "This isn't guarding," he said. The word had weight that went past the sentence it was contained in. "This is confinement without care." Boyd's expression hardened past irritation toward something that wanted to become genuine threat, but couldn't quite locate the appropriate mechanism. His eyes went to the chain on the ground, then to the dog pressed against Cole's leg, with the unambiguous alignment of an animal that had made a choice about where it stood, and then to Cole's face where whatever he was looking for apparently wasn't accessible enough to give him what he needed. He said something about property rights and legal liability and county ordinances governing access to commercial sites. Cole listened to all of it without responding to any of it, because none of it was actually the conversation they were having. Then he bent and lifted the dog, one arm beneath the chest, one beneath the hindquarters, the weight distributed and balanced with the practiced economy of someone who had carried things heavier than this in conditions far less forgiving. The shepherd did not resist. did not stiffen, yielded with a trust that was either the last resource of an animal too exhausted to protect itself, or something else. Something that Cole filed away in the part of his mind that hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Boyd's objections continued, and then tapered into silence that might have been recalculation. Cole crossed the gravel toward his truck without hurrying, without looking back. He heard Sadie move aside from the truck door. Before he reached it, not told to, just responding to the geometry of what was happening with the quick, quiet, cooperative intelligence of someone who had learned to read situations fast and adjust without being asked. He opened the back door of the truck, laid the shepherd carefully across the folded tarp he kept for equipment transport, and reached again for the water jug. Sadie had moved close enough now that he could see in the direct midday light the bruise on her forearm. The shape of it was specific: 4 fingers and a thumb, pressed with enough force to leave their outline on the pale skin in yellowed green. 3 or 4 days old, judging by the color. She wasn't looking at the bruise. She was looking at the dog. "He'll be okay," Cole said quietly. Not a guarantee. He didn't make guarantees about things he couldn't control. But steadiness offered with the deliberateness of someone who understood the difference between a promise and a foundation. She nodded once in the small, compressed way of someone swallowing more than a nod's worth of response. Cole closed the truck door gently and walked around to the driver's side. Boyd Crane was still standing in the middle of the yard when Cole pulled out onto the gravel road, growing smaller in the rearview mirror, arms crossed and expression rigid. The posture of a man who has lost a round but hasn't yet decided whether to call it a round. In the back seat, visible in the mirror's lower edge, the shepherd's ears lifted fractionally, not with alarm, but with the incremental recovery of an animal whose systems were slowly being reminded that functioning was still possible. Cole kept his eyes on the road and drove toward town. The veterinary clinic occupied the quieter end of Main Street, a low adobe building painted in desert beige with a faded blue awning that moved in the afternoon's dry, half-hearted wind. Cole parked and carried the shepherd inside in a single, continuous motion, the kind of entrance that communicated urgency without panic, and that caused Megan at the front desk to come around the counter rather than reach for the intake forms. Dr. Ellen Marsh met them in the treatment room before Cole had time to set the dog down. She was 38, lean and direct, with dark hair pulled back from a face that had been trained by a career in animal medicine to assess conditions fast and without the elaborate social framing that human medicine sometimes required. She had grown up on a ranch outside Elko, had lost animals to heat she should have caught earlier, and had taken both lessons into practice. Her movements in the treatment room carried the efficiency of someone who had learned that time spent explaining was time the patient didn't have. "How long?" she asked, examining gum color and skin elasticity simultaneously, her fingers moving with practiced economy. "In this heat, minimum 2 hours, probably longer." Cole stood at the table's edge with his hands resting lightly on the surface. Chain was too short to reach shade. Bowl was down and dry. Dr. Marsh didn't receive this information with surprise. She received it the way she received all findings as a fact, to be added to a working model she would deal with after the immediate problem was resolved: severe dehydration, heat stress onset, the neck wounds infected, been untreated for days at minimum. She looked up briefly, not with accusation, but with the reflexive assessment of someone who evaluates all variables in a situation. IV fluids, antibiotics, cooling protocol. He's young and his heart rate is strong for the condition. but if he'd stayed out there through the afternoon. She didn't complete the sentence, not because it wasn't worth completing, but because completion wasn't necessary. Cole reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded envelope, set it on the stainless counter beside the treatment tray. "Do what needs doing," he said. Dr. Marsh looked at the envelope for a moment, then at Cole with the careful attention a person directed at something they were noting for reasons not yet fully formulated. Then she nodded and turned back to the dog. Cole remained at the head of the table while the IV line was placed, one hand resting near the shepherd's shoulder. Not restraining, not pressing, simply present in the way that animals and people in extremity sometimes needed something to be present. 3 hours later, the shepherd lay on layered towels in a recovery kennel beneath a circulating fan, and his breathing had found a rhythm that was no longer the rapid, shallow labor of a system under critical stress, but something slower and more even. The respiratory rate of an animal that had been pulled back from an edge, and knew in whatever way animals know things that it had been pulled back. Cole sat beside the kennel on a stool that Megan had brought without being asked. Up close in the clinic's controlled light, the shepherd's features had reorganized themselves around a slightly softer version of the same face. The eyes were clearer now, the dark brown less clouded, though still carrying the heaviness that followed a system-level insult. The muzzle, relaxed in rest, showed the clean lines of good working genetics, a face that had been designed to do something. Cole studied it for a long time without speaking. He was thinking about the way the dog had gone still when he said, "Easy." About the response not trained to him specifically, but trained to that register, that cadence, that shape of human voice communicating through tone rather than words. About the way the dog had pressed against his chest in the truck yard, not demanding and not afraid, just aligning. He was thinking about Rex, not with the sharp, intrusive force that the memory usually arrived with the threshold. The explosion, the silence that followed, but with a different quality. Something that felt almost like comparison rather than wound. Rex had had that stillness, that capacity for alignment, that attentiveness that working line shepherds carried like a second nature. The readiness that never fully switched off, even in rest. This dog had it too. "He'll need a name for the file," Megan said from behind the desk, her voice carrying the light, careful tone of someone who had learned to read rooms and adjust accordingly. "For our records." Cole didn't answer immediately. Naming was not a casual act. He had learned that in the military, where call signs and designations carried weight that went past their function, where what you called something declared something about how you intended to relate to it. He had never named anything casually, and he did not intend to start now. He looked at the dog in the kennel, at the steady rise and fall of the chest beneath the black and tan fur, at the way the ears twitched faintly in response to the sounds of the clinic. Even in recovery, the monitoring instinct still present, and still functioning beneath everything the past days had done to the body that housed it. "Diesel," Cole said. Megan looked up. "Because it doesn't quit," he said. She wrote it down. Dr. Marsh returned from the workstation at the side of the room, carrying an expression Cole had learned over decades of reading faces under conditions of stress. To categorize as controlled surprise, the look of someone who has encountered something unexpected and is managing their initial response before presenting it. "I ran the microchip," she said. She held the tablet toward him so he could see the screen. "This dog isn't a stray. He's not a private pet. He's registered to the Nevada Department of Public Safety's K-9 Development Program out of Carson City. Cole looked at the screen. The registration was clear. The photo on file showed Diesel at approximately 5 months in the structured environment of a training facility, a handler visible at the edge of the frame. The status column read, "Missing. Reported February 14th. Case open." 5 months. The dog had been missing for 5 months. That means, Megan started. He was stolen, Cole said. The word landed in the room with the gravity of a word that organizes the information around it. Not adopted out informally. Not purchased through an irregular channel. Not lost by accident. Stolen. From a state law enforcement training program. By or through a man named Boyd Crane, who had chains of the appropriate length already installed in the wall of a warehouse on a property he was using for purposes that had not been explained, and that Cole was now actively interested in understanding. He sat with this for a moment. Dr. Marsh was already on the phone with the county sheriff's office. Cole looked at Diesel, who was looking back at him from the kennel, with the clear, unhurried attention of an animal whose immediate crisis had passed, and who was now reassembling itself around its more fundamental orientation, to be watchful and present and available for whatever came next. Cole understood that orientation completely. "Hey," he said quietly. The ears lifted. "You did good," he said. "You didn't quit." Diesel held his gaze for a long moment, then settled his chin onto his forepaws with the deliberate, dignified ease of an animal that had somewhere to be and was simply waiting for the appropriate time to be there. Cole sat back and let the information settle. Boyd Crane had a stolen police K-9 chained in a warehouse on property he controlled on the edge of town, chained short enough to ensure the animal couldn't reach shade, chained long enough that it couldn't be heard from the road, in a facility officially listed as inactive, but that appeared based on the condition of certain electrical infrastructure to have seen recent activity that Sandra Keel's management notes hadn't reflected. Cole was an electrician. He understood circuits. He understood what it meant when load indicators on a supposedly dormant system showed evidence of recent draw. He also understood with the same bone-level clarity that had once guided him through compound corridors in the dark that what was chained in that warehouse yard was not the largest thing Boyd Crane was trying to keep from being found. Somewhere across town, in a house Cole didn't know the address of yet, a girl with a bruise shaped like a hand on her forearm was sitting with whatever knowledge she carried about what her father kept in that warehouse and what it meant. Cole stood up from the stool, stretched his back, and looked at the clock on the clinic wall. He had appointments tomorrow. He did not intend to keep them. The desert outside Copper Ridge had gone dark and quiet and vast, and in a recovery kennel on Main Street, Diesel breathed steadily in and out his system, reclaiming its functions one by one, his ears still faintly tracking the sounds of the building around him, even in rest. And in the plastic chair beside the kennel, Cole Harmon sat in the stillness of a man who has spent 22 months walking away from things and has just with very little drama and no ceremony at all stopped. Something in that warehouse yard had looked at him and refused to give up. He intended to find out what else was in there. Cole brought Diesel home on the 3rd morning. Dr. Marsh had kept the shepherd for 48 hours of monitoring IV fluids antibiotic injections on scheduled temperature checks every 4 hours through the first night. By the second evening, Diesel's gum color had returned to a normal pink, and his eyes had cleared to the sharp, alert brown that belonged to a dog whose systems were no longer in crisis but were actively rebuilding. He ate with controlled appetite, drank steadily, and tracked the movements of everyone in the clinic with the attentive professional calm of an animal whose fundamental orientation toward the world had survived everything that had been done to it. When Cole arrived on the third morning with a folded canvas mat and a clean collar purchased from the hardware store on Elm No Chain, just a flat nylon band in dark green, Dr. Marsh handed over the discharge instructions with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did, and then paused at the end of her summary. "He responded to structured handling from the start," she said. "Not just to you, to anyone who approached with the right register." She folded the discharge sheet along its crease. "That's not a dog that was used for guarding. Whatever he was trained for, it was something that required him to trust handlers selectively but reliably." "I know," Cole said. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating attention of someone who has decided not to ask a question out loud, but has noted the answer she would have received. "Sheriff Greer's been updated on the registration status. It's in the system now." Cole nodded leashed Diesel with a single practice motion and walked them both out into the morning. The house on Sagebrush Lane was a single-story rental with a gravel yard and a mesquite tree near the back fence that was old enough to have developed genuine opinions about its place in the landscape. It offered shade in the mornings when the sun was still working its way across the eastern sky, and it was beneath this tree that Cole set up the canvas mat and the water bowl and the simple architecture of what he intended to do next. He did not rush. He had learned across years of working with Rex, and before Rex, that the instinct to rush the early stages of trust was the most reliable way to undermine everything that came after it. Trust built in increments, and it built on consistency. And what it did not do, under any circumstances in any context, was build in response to urgency applied from the outside. You could force a dog to comply. You could not force a dog to partner. On the first morning, he simply sat near the mat and let Diesel investigate the yard at the length of a loose lead, tracking what interested the shepherd and noting what the shepherd noted. The mesquite tree, the fence line, the direction of prevailing wind off the desert, the sound profile of the neighborhood distant traffic, Mrs. Adeline Cross's wind chimes 2 houses down, the periodic mechanical groan of a swamp cooler, cycling on the block behind them. Diesel cataloged all of it with the systematic thoroughness of a working dog, remapping its operational environment, which was what Cole had expected, and what he was content to observe. On the second morning, he introduced the first commands, not new commands. He had no way of knowing what commands had been used in Diesel's training program, and no interest in creating confusion by overlapping new language with existing conditioning. What he used were the commands he had used with Rex, delivered in the same register and cadence, and he watched for recognition. It came immediately and clearly. "Sit." The shepherd sat. Not with the explosive eagerness of a dog trying to earn something, but with the quiet, clean response of an animal to whom the command was familiar vocabulary, understood, processed, and acted on without need for elaboration. "Stay." Diesel held position while Cole walked a slow circle around him, breaking the hold only when released with a flat palm. Easy. The word Cole had used in the warehouse yard, a word he had used with Rex in 100 situations where something needed to be slowed and steadied without being stopped. Diesel responded to it the way he had responded in that first moment, with focused calm, like a current that had been redirected without being shut off. Cole sat back on his heels after the third session and looked at the shepherd for a long moment. Diesel looked back. "Somebody put real work into you," Cole said, not to himself and not quite to the dog, but to the space between them where the fact of it existed regardless of audience. Diesel's tail moved once a single measured sweep that was nothing like the indiscriminate enthusiasm of a dog trying to please. It was more like acknowledgement, a brief confirmation that the observation had been received. Mrs. Adeline Cross watched from her back porch. She was 68, silver-haired and upright, despite the arthritis that had reorganized the way she moved through the world over the past decade, and she occupied her rocker with the patient, composed attention of a woman who had learned that observation was its own form of participation. Her husband, Captain Wallace Cross, had died in 1971 in a place that she had spent 40 years not saying aloud. And what that loss had given her, among other things, was a reliable capacity to recognize the geometry of a man carrying grief he had not yet decided what to do with. She had recognized it in Cole Harmon within the first week of his arrival on Sagebrush Lane, though she had said nothing about it then and had said nothing about it since. She simply watched with the unhurried attentiveness of someone who understood that some things required observation over time before they yielded their meaning. She watched Cole work with the dog in the mornings. She watched the way he crouched rather than stood when giving commands, closing the physical distance that hierarchy kept open. She watched the way he waited for Diesel's responses without filling the waiting with sound or movement, giving the animal space to find its own way to the correct answer, rather than being pulled there by impatience. She had seen her husband work with horses the same way once on a ranch outside Flagstaff, the summer before he deployed. She had never forgotten that quality of attention, the kind that treated the animal as a participant rather than a subject. On the fourth morning, she brought 2 cups of coffee to the fence line without asking whether Cole wanted one, set them on the top rail, and returned to her porch. Cole looked at the cups for a moment, then picked one up, drank half of it standing, and set it back without looking toward the porch. It was the most comfortable social exchange he'd had in 9 months. Walt Greer arrived on the 6th day in the late afternoon, when the heat had softened to merely oppressive, rather than actively punishing, driving his county patrol vehicle up the gravel drive, with the deliberateness of a man who had learned that arriving without urgency was often more effective than arriving with it. He was 55, broad-shouldered in the weathered way of men who had been physically capable for long enough that capability had become structural rather than maintained, with dark hair, going gray at the temples, and a trimmed mustache above a mouth that formed its words with measured care, suggesting each one had been considered before deployment. He had been sheriff of this county for 11 years, and before that a deputy for 14. And what that duration had given him was not certainty. He'd grown skeptical of certainty, but a reliable capacity to distinguish between the kinds of trouble that resolved themselves and the kinds that didn't. Cole was in the yard with Diesel when Greer's boots hit the gravel. They regarded each other for a moment with the mutual, unhurried assessment of 2 men who had both spent time in environments where Reading people quickly was operationally relevant. Dr. Marsh told me you found him at the Consolidated Solar property on Route 9, Greer said, stopping at the yard gate with his hands loose at his sides. That's right. Boyd Crane runs a maintenance operation out of that facility, or says he does. Greer's eyes moved to Diesel studying the dog with the attention of someone who had been briefed on a registration report. Carson City's been notified about the dog. They'll want to make a formal determination about custody given the open case. Cole waited. Greer looked back at him. You want to tell me what you saw out there besides the dog? Wiring in the main shed showed recent load draws inconsistent with a dormant facility, Cole said. Secondary warehouse looked like it had seen regular traffic. Ground around the south entrance was compacted from vehicle weight within the past few weeks. Greer absorbed this without changing his expression. That's consistent with what we've been building on Crane for the past several months. He paused. Small-scale operation on paper. Buying decommissioned solar equipment from commercial sites across the region, reselling it locally at below-market rates to contractors who don't ask too many questions about provenance. Stolen, Cole said. Allegedly. Greer said the word with the tone of a man who used it because procedure required it, not because he had personal uncertainty about the underlying fact. We've matched serial numbers on 3 panel arrays to theft reports out of Clark and Washoe counties. The documentation trail has gaps wide enough to drive a truck through, which may be intentional. He let the implications settle. We're building toward a warrant. Takes time when you want it to hold. Cole looked at Diesel, who had settled beside him with the alert, relaxed posture of an animal that was present in a conversation without being part of it. His daughter, Cole said. Sadie, 11 years old. She was with him at the facility the day I found the dog. I know about Sadie. Something in Greer's voice adjusted by a fractional degree, not softening exactly, but recalibrating the way a careful man adjusted when a conversation moved from operational to human. Her mother passed away 2 years ago. Vehicle accident on Route 93, night conditions, single car. He held Cole's gaze steadily. Case was closed as accident. Cole said nothing. I said closed, Greer said. I didn't say resolved. The distinction landed in the afternoon air between them, with the weight of a sentence that had more architecture beneath it than its surface suggested. Cole filed it precisely where it belonged, and did not ask the follow-up question that Greer would not have been able to answer yet. You find anything else out there besides the electrical readings? Greer said, returning to the procedural register. I'd appreciate you letting me know. Likewise, Cole said. Greer nodded once turned back toward the patrol vehicle and paused with his hand on the door. You were with the K-9 program, he said. Not a question. Rex, Eastern Theater. A brief pause. I read the report when you moved to the county. Background check on new residents with your service record is standard. He looked back. I'm sorry about the dog. Cole received this without responding to it, because there was nothing to respond to. That wouldn't have required more conversation than either of them had come here to have. Greer got in his vehicle and drove back down Sagebrush Lane, and the gravel settled into quiet. And Diesel pressed lightly against Cole's leg with the patient, uncomplicated weight of an animal simply choosing where to stand. She came at dusk on the 8th day. Cole saw her at the gate before she knocked. He had been sitting on the back step in the cooling evening air watching Diesel patrol the yard fence line in the slow, systematic way that had become their end-of-day routine, and the sound of sneakers on gravel at the side of the house reached him with enough advance notice to be on his feet and around the corner. Before she'd raised her hand to the latch, she startled when he appeared, then reset her expression with the rapid, practiced composure of a child who had learned that showing surprise in her father's presence had sometimes made things worse. "I found out where you live from the clinic," she said. Not an apology and not a preamble, just structural information placed first to account for the question she assumed he was asking. The woman at the desk. I told her I needed to say thank you. A brief hesitation. She probably shouldn't have told me. Probably not, Cole said. He opened the gate and she came in staying close to the fence line, the way she had stayed close to the truck door at the facility, not hiding exactly, but keeping something solid within reach. Diesel moved toward her with careful, measured interest. Head slightly lowered. Not submissive, but deferential. The greeting of a dog trained to approach unfamiliar humans with controlled courtesy rather than unchecked enthusiasm. She held out her hand, palm down. Diesel sniffed it, then shifted his weight back in the way that communicated acceptance, and she exhaled something that was almost not audible. "He's okay," she said. Not a question. She had already established that with her eyes from across the yard. "He's better than okay," Cole said. "Sit down if you want." She sat on the back step, and Cole sat on the overturned milk crate he used for a second seat. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, watching Diesel circle back toward the mesquite tree with the purposeful looseness of an animal that was simply being itself in a space where nothing was threatening it. Then Sadie Crane began to talk. She did it the way Cole had noticed some people talked when they had been carrying something for a long time, without an appropriate place to set it down. In a controlled rush, each sentence placed quickly before the hesitation could catch up and shut it off. She talked about the dog first because the dog was the entry point, the thing they shared. And then she moved outward from there, the way a person moved outward from a known landmark when mapping unfamiliar territory. Boyd Crane had not purchased Diesel. He had received the dog from a man named Vickers, who was part of the equipment network, someone who moved things from places where they were accounted for to places where they weren't. The dog had been part of a transaction that Sadie didn't fully understand. Something involving a favor or a debt. And Boyd had seen the animal's size and accepted it without asking the questions. That asking would have required him to confront. Diesel had tried to escape twice. The first time he had made it 3 miles before being found near the highway. The second time Boyd had brought him back and shortened the chain, and that had been the last time the dog had gone anywhere. "I tried to bring him water," Sadie said, "at night after my dad was asleep. I got caught the second time." She stopped. Her hands were clasped in her lap in a deliberate, effortful stillness. "He said if I went out there again, he'd move the dog somewhere I couldn't find." Cole looked at the side of her face, the serious, freckled profile of a child who had been required to understand too many things too soon and said nothing because saying nothing was sometimes the correct response when someone was still in the process of saying what they'd come to say. "The warehouse has more stuff than what you saw," she said. "There are crates of wiring and panels stacked in the back section. Serial numbers filed off some of them." She paused. "My dad thinks he's being careful. He doesn't think anyone's been paying attention." Another pause, smaller. "A sheriff came to the house once, 6 months ago. My dad sent me to my room and I heard him talking through the door. The sheriff left after 20 minutes, and my dad was in a good mood for a week. That wasn't Sheriff Greer, Cole said. She looked at him. No, different man, younger. He came in a private car, not a county vehicle. She said this with the precise recall of someone who had learned to pay attention to details as a form of self-protection. Cole filed that. Sadie, he said, your mother. She went very still. You don't have to, he said. She looked at the yard for a long moment. Diesel had settled near the mesquite tree, watching them both with his chin resting on his forepaws, present and quiet. She kept her name after they married, Sadie said. My dad didn't like it. She said it was the one thing she held on to that was hers. A pause then. Carol Hollis. That was her name. She was proud of it. Cole waited. She was going to report him, Sadie continued. Her voice had changed register, flatter, more careful, the way voices became when carrying something with sharp edges. She'd been collecting information for months, writing things down, taking photographs of the warehouse, keeping a record of when the trucks came and what they brought. A breath. She had a box, a small wooden box she'd found at a swap meet, and she kept everything in it. Letters she'd written, photos, a USB drive, with records and dates and names. She told me about it 2 weeks before she died. Sadie's jaw moved slightly. She said if anything ever happened to her, the box was in the warehouse, in the far corner under a false panel in the floor. She said my father would never think to look there because it was his space, and he thought he controlled it. Cole was very still. She said he'd been told once before that someone was asking questions about his operation, Sadie continued. Someone tipped him off, and the person who'd been asking questions had a car accident on a mountain road 6 days later. She looked at Cole directly for the first time since sitting down. My mother drove that road every 2 weeks to see her sister in Ely. She was a careful driver. She'd driven it in worse conditions than that night. The desert outside the fence had gone quiet, in the way it went quiet at dusk. The heat releasing and the cooling air settling, and the only sounds were Diesel's steady breathing and the distant faint percussion of Mrs. Cross's wind chimes. Cole looked at the girl sitting on his back step, 11 years old, with a bruise that had faded to a yellow-green ghost on her forearm, and a clarity in her eyes that had been purchased by the specific education of growing up in a house where knowing things mattered, but saying them cost more than most children should have to pay. Does anyone else know about the box? He said. No, she said. I didn't tell anyone. I was scared that if I did, it would happen to them too. She looked down at her hands. Or to me. You told me, Cole said. You came for the dog, she said simply. People who come for the dog are different. She said it without sentimentality, as a factual observation, the way a child stated something they had been thinking about for a long time and had decided was true. Cole looked at Diesel. Diesel looked back. Go home, Cole said. Don't go to the warehouse. Don't tell your father you were here. He paused. I'm going to talk to Sheriff Greer. She stood up, brushed her hands on her jeans with a quick, self-contained gesture. The box is in the northwest corner, she said. False floor panel. You can feel the seam if you know where to press. Then she walked back through the gate and down the gravel drive and turned at the road without looking back. And Cole stood in his yard in the cooling dusk and understood with absolute clarity that Boyd Crane was not the end of this. He was the visible part. Somewhere beneath him was a structure with depth that had protected itself before by removing the person who threatened it, and that had been operating long enough to have grown comfortable with its own continued existence. He took out his phone and called Walt Greer. The next 5 days moved in parallel tracks. On the surface, the town of Copper Ridge operated with its normal desert summer economy. The hardware store and the diner and the gas stations, and the small, resilient commerce of a community that had learned to live with heat, the way other communities learn to live with cold. Cole continued his morning training sessions with Diesel, the sessions growing longer and more complex as the shepherd's strength returned fully, and his responses sharpened from the bluntness of recovery into the precision of a working animal, reclaiming its training. Diesel had been good before whatever had happened to him. He was becoming something beyond good under the specific patient attention of someone who treated him as a full partner in what they were building together. Mrs. Cross watched and said nothing, which was its own form of commentary. On the other track, the one not visible from the street, Walt Greer was working. He had absorbed Cole's relay of Sadie's information with the same careful, unhurried attention. He applied to everything, asking clarifying questions about the former deputy, about the private car, about the timeline of Carol Hollis's accident, relative to her collecting of evidence. He had spent 2 days with county records before sharing what he found with Cole in a brief phone call whose brevity was inversely proportional to its significance. The former deputy, a man named Garrett Finch, who had resigned from the county sheriff's office 14 months ago and taken a position with a private security company headquartered in Henderson, had been the one to close the original report that Carol Hollis had attempted to file 2 years prior, closed with the notation insufficient evidentiary basis for formal investigation. Filed on a Friday afternoon, Garrett Finch had submitted his resignation the following Monday, citing personal reasons. His new employer's client list included 3 companies that had reported decommissioned equipment stolen in the preceding 18 months. The thread connected to itself the way threads did when you pulled them from the right end. Greer was 24 hours from a viable warrant when Boyd Crane made the decision that accelerated everything. Cole didn't know what tipped Boyd, whether it was Sadie's demeanor at home or some signal from within the network, or simply the accumulating pressure of a man who had spent 2 years operating with the confidence of someone who believed the mechanism protecting him was still functional. What Cole knew was that on the evening of the 12th day, Boyd Crane drove to the warehouse at Route 9 with a speed that his neighbor fueling up at the gas station on the service road noticed and later described to Greer as like a man going somewhere to put out a fire before anyone else could see the smoke. The metaphor would turn out to be precisely incorrect. What Boyd intended to do at the warehouse was remove the most incriminating panels, the ones with the closest matches to documented theft reports, the ones Greer's warrant would target most directly. He intended to move them to a secondary location that night, and to ensure that by the time the warrant was executed, the counts were thin enough to argue down to a civil matter rather than a criminal one. What Boyd did not know, because he did not know that Sadie knew about the box, was that Sadie had gone to the warehouse 40 minutes ahead of him. She had gone for the box, not to deliver it to anyone, not yet. She had gone because Greer's investigation was moving in ways she could feel, without being told explicitly, and because the box had been her mother's work, her mother's risk, her mother's last act of trying to make something right. and she needed to be the one to carry it out of that place before anything else happened to it. She needed it not to be left in the ground under her father's floor. It was a reasonable thing to want. It was also the worst possible timing. She was in the northwest corner of the warehouse on her knees, pressing along the floor seam with her fingers when the lights in the main corridor flickered and held and flickered again and did not come back. The junction box for the secondary warehouse had been a problem. Cole had identified on his first visit aging insulation on a secondary breaker circuit, connections oxidized and loose, the kind of wiring that in a maintained facility would have been flagged and replaced, and in an unmaintained one simply continued to degrade until the conditions for ignition assembled themselves with the patient inevitability of things left unattended too long. It was the heat that finished it, not dramatically, not a visible spark and a dramatic surge, just the accumulated effect of another day above 110 degrees on wiring that had already given most of what it had to give, and a connection that let go in the junction box inside the wall with a small private brightness that found the dry interior insulation and held. 3 weeks earlier, Boyd had consulted a different electrician about the facility's operational lines and had been told the secondary junction housing needed immediate replacement. He had not scheduled the repair. He had instead removed the protective housing from the circuit. Entirely, forensic investigators would confirm this within 48 hours, leaving bare, degraded wiring exposed to the heat cycles of a Nevada summer, in a building filled with dry cardboard and oil-stained rags. Whether the resulting fire had been an intended outcome or simply a risk Boyd had accepted in the service of a faster plan, the effect was the same. The smoke came first in the particular acrid density of electrical fire, thick and low and fast-moving in a way that open flame fire was not. Sadie smelled it before she saw it. She found the box. She pulled it free and held it against her chest and stood up and turned toward the corridor, and the corridor was a wall of gray-black smoke that had no visible bottom. She went back down to the floor where air lingered and moved along the baseboard toward where she believed the side door was and found the storage cabinets instead, and understood she had gone the wrong direction, and the smoke was thickening around her with the fast democratic thoroughness of something that did not distinguish between innocent and guilty. She put her back against the metal cabinet and pressed her face into the crook of her elbow and held the box and tried to breathe small. Boyd Crane pulled into the facility yard 11 minutes later to find smoke already leaking from the roofline vents. He stood at the driver's side door of his truck for 4 full seconds. Cole knew this from the single statement Boyd made later that could not be explained away. And then he got back in his truck and drove toward the highway rather than toward the building. His daughter was inside. He did not know this, but he had not been certain she was not there either, and he had driven away. That was the fact. That was what the 12-day structure of this story came down to, not the stolen panels or the network or Garrett Finch or any of it. A man who had built his entire life around the geometry of self-protection arrived at the moment that geometry finally required something real of him, and found that there was nothing behind it. Cole was in the yard with Diesel at 9:47 in the evening, running a final short session before the full dark settled when the scanner in his truck crackled from the open window. Walt Greer's voice clipped and direct. Structure fire, Route 9, old consolidated solar facility, secondary warehouse, fire crews from Mineral County en route ETA 15 minutes. possible occupant unaccounted for. Cole stood in the gravel yard and heard the address and heard occupant, and both pieces of information traveled through him simultaneously and met at the same point. He moved toward the truck. Diesel was already at the passenger door. Cole had not called him, had not gestured, had not issued any command. The shepherd had read the shift in posture and stride, and the compression of a man who had gone from training mode to operational without transition, and had responded the way a working dog responded when its partner moved with purpose by moving with him. Cole opened the door and Diesel jumped in, and Cole started the engine and turned onto Sagebrush Lane heading west, and the night ahead of them was dark and still, until the glow on the horizon resolved itself into something that was not a sunset. He pressed the accelerator down, and the headlights cut through the desert, and Diesel sat in the passenger seat with his ears high and his body aligned toward the windshield. And for a moment in the dark interior of the truck, Cole felt the presence beside him alert, available, directed toward the same point that he had not felt from that seat in 22 months. He did not allow himself to fully form the thought. He drove. The fire at the Route 9 facility was already visible from 3 miles out, a glow above the roofline that pulsed and breathed against the black Nevada sky, the orange-white brightness of a structure fire that had found sufficient fuel and was no longer a contained problem, but an evolving one. Cole could see the smoke rising in a column that the night wind was bending southward, and beneath it, the low, wide silhouette of the secondary warehouse with its corrugated metal walls and its collapsing sense of itself. He pushed harder on the accelerator, and the desert came at them fast, and Diesel didn't move, didn't shift, just rode with his nose pointed forward and his ears tracking the fire's sound as it grew. And Cole drove toward it with his jaw set, and something in his chest that was not calm, but was the thing that lived adjacent to calm. In men who had trained long enough that training became second nature, which was clarity. Not about outcome, because outcomes weren't his to control, but about action, which was the one thing that was. He had been too late once. He was not gonna be too late again. Walt Greer's cruiser was already at the perimeter when Cole arrived. Flashers painting the yard in intermittent red and blue, and at the far edge of the light stood the shape of Boyd Crane, unmoving with the posture of a man who had arrived at a scene he had created and was watching it. The way guilty men watch things, not with the horror of someone confronting the unexpected, but with the recognition of someone confronting the exact magnitude of what they had chosen. Cole parked and stepped out. Diesel hit the ground beside him before Cole had straightened to his full height and stood at his left knee, with his ears high and his muscles tensed with controlled readiness. And Walt Greer came across the gravel toward them with the long, deliberate stride of a man carrying information that could not wait for him to arrive at normal speed. "Sadie's inside," Greer said. His voice was flat with the flatness of a man managing the distance between what he was feeling and what he needed to function. "Boyd says he doesn't know. Boyd says he wasn't sure. Boyd." He stopped because the sentence had no useful ending that fit inside the constraints of what could be said in a professional capacity. "Fire crews are 12 minutes out. The side entrance is still passable." He looked at Cole. Cole looked at the building. He was calculating wind direction, smoke density at the lower vents, the location of the secondary corridor, relative to where Sadie would logically have been in the northwest corner. He was mapping it the way he had mapped compound interiors before entries, building the spatial model in his head with the information he had from his first visit. and the information the smoke was currently providing about where the fire was hottest. 12 minutes. The structure of the situation was very clear. He looked down at Diesel. Diesel was already looking at him. Had been looking at him since they'd stopped with the direct, steady focus of an animal, waiting for the word that would turn readiness into motion. Cole said quietly, "Find." And they went in. The side entrance was a metal door propped 3 inches open by a cinder block that had been there long enough to have settled permanently into the gravel. And when Cole pushed through it with his shoulder, the air that met him was a different order of heat than the Nevada night outside. Not the dry mineral warmth of desert evening, but something compressive and immediate, the kind of heat that had weight to it, that pressed against exposed skin and the inside of the throat with the insistence of a physical object rather than a condition. He dropped low without breaking stride. The smoke was thickest at the ceiling, moving in slow, purposeful rolls that the structural geometry of the warehouse was channeling toward the front of the building, where the main junction fire was still working. Down at floor level, there was a narrow stratum of relatively cleaner air. Not clean, not breathable in any comfortable sense, but functional for the period of time that Cole was calculating this would require. Diesel moved ahead of him in the compressed, efficient crouch of a dog, navigating a compromised environment. Nose working continuously, ears rotating with the attentive precision of instruments rather than organs. Cole kept his left hand in contact with the wall building, the spatial model in his head, against the near-zero visibility. The corridor width, the location of the first storage bay opening on the right. The angle of the turn that would take them toward the secondary storage section where the northwest corner was. He had been in this building once before for approximately 40 minutes, under entirely different conditions. He trusted what he had cataloged then. He trusted the dog beside him more. The corridor bent left and the smoke thickened. Cole pulled his collar up over his nose and mouth and kept moving, and then Diesel's body changed. The shepherd's forward motion altered with a clarity that needed no translation. The difference between a dog navigating and a dog tracking the shift from environmental awareness to specific pursuit. Diesel angled right toward the far storage section. Cole followed without hesitation. Behind them, something in the main corridor produced a sharp, percussive crack. A beam connection giving way or a stored panel shifting under structural compromise. The building revising its own architecture in response to the fire's work. The sound was followed by a surge of heat and a brief brightening of the smoke to the orange-gray of proximity to active flame, and Cole registered both without stopping because stopping was not the available option. Diesel was moving faster now. The tracking posture definitive, and then the shepherd stopped and stood, and his stillness was the stillness of arrival. Cole came up alongside him and saw it in the reddish half-dark. The metal cabinet, the northeast corner she had described northwest. But in the smoke and the disorientation of a burning building with no visible landmarks, the distinction had collapsed, and what mattered was that she had found the most solid thing in the room and put her back against it and gotten as low as she could get. And she was there. Sadie Crane was on her side on the concrete floor, one arm folded over her face, her knees drawn up the wooden box pressed flat against her chest, with both arms crossed over it in the protective geometry of someone who had made a deliberate choice about what they were going to hold on to. Her hair was loose around her shoulders and threaded with ash. Her eyes were closed. Cole was beside her in 3 strides. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck. and found her pulse immediately fast. Stressed but strong, and even the heartbeat of a body in fight mode rather than shutdown mode. He leaned close to her ear and said her name, and her eyes opened unfocused at first, and then finding him with the labored effort of someone swimming up through several layers toward consciousness. She coughed a hard, productive cough that bent her forward, and that Cole recognized as a better sign than the shallow, ineffective cough of serious smoke inhalation. Her lungs were working. They were working against poor conditions, but they were working. "I've got you," he said. "Same register as easy. Low, steady, calibrated to be received rather than just heard." She looked at him and then at Diesel, who had positioned himself at her other side, with his body oriented toward the corridor and his nose still reading the air. And something moved through her expression that was not quite relief. Relief came after, when the danger had resolved, but was the immediate clarifying recognition of not alone, of company in the worst place. "The box," she said. Her voice was a wreck of itself, scraped raw. "I've got it," Cole said. "Don't let go." He slid one arm beneath her shoulders and lifted her to a seated position, first giving her system a moment to adjust, then brought his other arm beneath her knees and stood in one controlled motion, distributing her weight with the practiced economy of someone who had extracted injured personnel from compromised spaces before, and who understood that the quality of the carry mattered as much as the speed. She kept her arms around the box. He kept moving. Diesel was already ahead of them, returning the way they had come. And Cole followed the shepherd's path through the smoke with the kind of trust that had no room for doubt. Not because doubt was absent, but because the situation had reduced the available cognitive resources to what was essential. And what was essential was the dog's nose and the floor beneath Cole's boots, and the weight of the girl in his arms, and the direction of the door. The corridor was worse on the return. The fire had advanced along the ceiling during the time they'd been in the storage section, the orange-red light more present now. And the heat had increased in the way heat increased when a fire stopped being a localized problem and started reorganizing the available space to suit itself. Cole felt it against the top of his head and across his shoulders, the directional heat of something above you that wants to come down. He moved faster. Diesel reached the side door and hit it with his shoulder, pushing through the gap and into the night. And Cole came through 3 seconds later with Sadie in his arms and the full force of Nevada night air against his face, which after the interior of the warehouse felt like stepping into cold water. He was 4 strides beyond the door when the section of roof they had been standing beneath came down. It came down with the catastrophic finality of corrugated metal under structural failure. A cascading sequence of sounds. First, the groan of stress supports releasing, then the progressive collapse, each section pulling the next, and then the impact, which produced a burst of sparks and heat that bloomed outward into the night air in a brief, spectacular expansion of orange light and forced the watching figures at the perimeter back 2 steps in unison. Cole didn't look back. He kept walking until he had crossed the perimeter tape, until the gravel gave way to the flattened earth where the emergency vehicles had parked. And then he knelt and laid Sadie down with the same careful deliberateness with which he had lifted her, ensuring her head was supported, her airway clear, her position stable. Diesel moved alongside her and stood and did not move away. Paramedic Amy Reeves had been staged at the perimeter since before Cole had gone in. and she was moving the moment he cleared the tape, a compact, focused woman in her early 40s with her blonde hair tucked beneath her cap, and the efficiency of someone who had been first on scene at enough desert emergencies to have developed an economy of motion that looked almost casual from the outside but wasn't. She was kneeling beside Sadie before Cole had fully straightened from setting her down, 2 fingers at the pulse assessment running in parallel with her first questions to the girl who was responding, coughing, answering in fragmented sentences, her eyes tracking with increasing coherence as the clean air worked on her system. Cole stepped back to give Reeves room to work. He was aware of ash on his hands, of the heat still radiating from his work shirt, of a rawness at the back of his throat, from the smoke that would probably be worse in the morning. He was aware of all of this the way a person was aware of physical information that existed below the threshold of things requiring immediate action. His eyes went to Diesel. The shepherd had remained beside Sadie while Reeves worked positioned at her left side, with the patient, settled quality of an animal that had completed its task and understood that the task was complete. His coat was dusted with ash along his back and shoulders, and his paw pads would need checking. Cole had already registered the texture of the ground inside and knew the heat would have gotten to them. But his breathing was even, and his eyes were clear, and his posture carried the quiet, dignified ease of a dog that had done what it was designed to do and was at rest in that knowledge. Cole crouched beside him. He ran his hands along the shepherd's legs and checked the paw pads. With careful fingers, surface irritation, some heat stress on the right front pad, nothing that rest and time wouldn't resolve. Diesel endured the examination with the compliance of an animal accustomed to being checked over after hard work. And when Cole was satisfied, he rested his palm flat against the dog's side between the shoulder and the ribs and held it there. He didn't say anything. Diesel turned his head and looked at him. Cole looked back. The fire crews from Mineral County arrived 6 minutes later in a coordinated deployment of hoses and personnel that brought the warehouse fire from active emergency to managed suppression. Within 15 minutes, the water hitting the heated metal with a sustained hiss that sent steam rising in thick columns that blurred the stars above the facility. The roof was largely gone. The walls remained standing with the hollow, gutted appearance of structures that had been emptied of everything that had made them functional. In the sustained brightness of the emergency lights, with the steam rising and the fire crews moving in organized patterns across the yard, Walt Greer's deputies moved through the perimeter with their own purpose, documenting, photographing, securing. The fire had done Boyd Crane no favors. The section of the warehouse that the roof collapse had opened to the sky was the section farthest from the active fire, the northwest storage area where the most organized and most incriminating inventory had been stored. The collapse had scattered rather than destroyed, and what it had scattered lay across the wet gravel in the flat illumination of the emergency lights with the availability of things that had been hidden and were hidden no longer. Stacked solar panel arrays, their surfaces scored with the shallow parallel lines of serial numbers that had been imperfectly removed. Imperfectly enough that the underlying impressions were still recoverable with the right light and the right angle. Coils of copper wiring in documented gauges that matched theft reports from commercial sites across 2 counties. Shipping manifests wet at the edges from the fire hose water, but largely legible, showing dates and quantities that did not correspond to any legitimate commercial operation. Cole watched Greer's deputies work and understood with the comprehensive clarity of a man who had spent his career reading situations to their conclusion that Boyd Crane's operation had just become entirely and irreversibly visible. Walt Greer came to stand beside Cole at the edge of the perimeter, while Amy Reeves completed Sadie's preliminary assessment and called for transport to the county hospital. As a precautionary measure for smoke inhalation monitoring, Greer was watching Boyd Crane, who was standing near the hood of his truck at the far edge of the light, with two of Greer's deputies positioned in the arrangement that meant he was not going anywhere, but had not yet been formally told so. Gas station attendant on the service road placed him here at 9:32, Greer said. His voice had the quality of a man reporting facts, because the facts were the only thing that currently required words. Fire started no earlier than 9:15 based on the neighbor's account of when the smoke became visible. A pause. He arrived, saw the smoke, and drove toward the highway. Another pause. He drove toward the highway. Cole said nothing. He says he didn't know she was inside. Greer continued. That may even be true. What's also true is that he was not certain she wasn't, and he made a choice that prioritized his own position over finding out. Greer's mustache moved slightly over the flat line of his mouth. That's a different category of action than not knowing. Cole watched Boyd Crane standing near his truck. The man was not looking at the ambulance where his daughter was being loaded onto a gurney. He was watching the deputies sorting through the scattered inventory from the collapsed storage section. His attention was on the panels, on the manifests, on the visible evidence of what he had constructed, and what was now being systematically documented in a way that could not be undone. Not at Sadie, at the evidence. Cole had seen a version of this before in different contexts, in different countries, in different circumstances. The moment when a person's fundamental hierarchy revealed itself under pressure. The moment when the carefully maintained architecture of a presented self came apart, and what was underneath looked outward at the world without the benefit of its covering. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply a man standing near his truck, watching inventory, instead of watching his daughter be loaded into an ambulance. That was enough. I'll need a statement from you about what you saw in there, Greer said, and what Sadie told you. He glanced at Cole briefly. Tonight if she's stable. Tomorrow morning if she needs rest. Tomorrow morning, Cole said. Let her rest. Greer nodded. He turned toward his deputies and walked back into the organized activity of the scene. And Cole stood alone at the perimeter tape with Diesel at his knee and watched the steam continue to rise from the collapsed warehouse in the diminishing brightness of the fire's last resistance. Across the yard, Boyd Crane was formally placed in handcuffs at 9:58. With the quiet procedural efficiency of law enforcement that had its documentation in order and its warrant ready to execute, and no remaining reason to delay. He did not resist. He said something that Cole couldn't hear from the perimeter, and one of the deputies responded briefly. And then Boyd was walked to the patrol vehicle with the settled gait of a man who has arrived at the specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing something unsustainable for a very long time, and has finally, against his will, been relieved of it. The charges, as Greer would outline them the following morning, were for possession of stolen property across county lines, criminal conspiracy to traffic stolen materials arson. The protective housing on the secondary junction box had been removed within the preceding 48 hours. Forensic analysis confirmed on a circuit Boyd had personally identified as critically compromised 3 weeks earlier, when he'd consulted an electrician about the facility's operational lines. He had not requested the repair, but had removed the housing instead, leaving degraded wiring exposed to the summer heat cycles of a building filled with dry materials and criminal reckless endangerment for leaving a minor in a burning structure. There would be additional investigation into Garrett Finch and his role in the original report suppression. There would be a reopened review of the Route 93 accident that had killed Carol Hollis 2 years prior. These were longer threads, and pulling them would take time that Cole was not part of. But the pulling had started, and starting was what mattered. It was enough for tonight. Sadie was conscious and stable when Cole arrived at the county hospital the following morning. She was in a private room at the end of the second-floor corridor. Oxygen saturation monitoring completed the smoke inhalation classified as mild to moderate with no indication of lower airway involvement. She would be discharged by early afternoon. She was sitting upright in the hospital bed when Cole and Diesel came in, a concession that Megan at the clinic had negotiated with the nursing staff by explaining with the calm certainty of someone who knew she was right, that the dog's presence was therapeutically relevant with her hair combed and her face clean, and an expression of focused, alert attention that suggested the previous night had clarified rather than depleted her. The wooden box sat on the bedside table. Cole looked at it and then at Sadie. "It made it," she said. The box was smoke-darkened at the corners, and the wood had swelled slightly from the ambient moisture of the fire hose water. But it was intact, the small brass clasp still functional, the interior dry where Sadie's arms had shielded it throughout the rescue, and the transport and the hospital admission. "I need to give it to Sheriff Greer," she said. Not reluctantly, with the settled certainty of someone who had decided what the right thing was and had arrived at that decision without needing to be directed towards it. "My mom put it there so it could be found. Keeping it doesn't honor that." Cole sat in the chair beside the bed, and Diesel settled on the floor between them, and Sadie opened the box. The interior was fitted with a thin foam lining the kind sold in craft stores for jewelry storage that Carol Hollis had repurposed to organize what she'd been collecting. Photographs printed and trimmed neatly showing the warehouse interior at various stages of inventory. Panel arrays stacked in organized rows, crates with their serial numbers visible, a man Cole didn't recognize offloading materials from a commercial vehicle. Handwritten notes in a compact, precise script that covered both sides of each page, recording dates and times and license plates and quantities. And the USB drive, small and gray, the standard commercial type. Carol Hollis had labeled it with a piece of white adhesive tape on which she had written in the same compact hand as the notes a single sentence: "For Sadie when she's ready." The room was quiet for a moment. Sadie looked at the label. Her eyes didn't fill, but something moved through her face that was more comprehensive than tears, the expression of a person who has been given across time. Something that arrived too late, and just in time simultaneously. She took a slow breath and held it, and then released it in the controlled way of someone managing something large with the tools that were available. She knew, Sadie said, not with bitterness, with the plainness that came after bitterness had been processed, and what remained was simply the fact. She knew she might not be there when I needed it. She looked at Cole. She prepared for that. Cole looked at the label. For Sadie when she's ready. He thought about preparation, the kind that took into account your own possible absence. He had done forms of it himself in the years before Copper Ridge, in the years when deployment meant calculating contingencies that included the contingency of not returning. He understood the quality of thought that produced something like this, the clarity it required, the love that operated through that clarity without being diminished by it. She was paying attention, Cole said. Sadie nodded. She closed the box with the brass clasp and held it in her lap for a moment. And then she looked at Diesel, who was watching her with the steady, uncomplicated attention that he directed at things he had decided warranted his full presence. She reached down and rested her hand on the top of his head. Diesel remained still beneath her hand with his eyes half closed. And she held that contact for a long moment. And then she straightened and looked at Cole with the directness of a child who had learned that the clearest things were best said clearly. "I'm going to Phoenix," she said. "My Aunt Diane is coming. She called this morning." She paused. "I've never met her. But she was my mom's sister, and she called the second she found out what happened, and she cried on the phone." A brief pause. "My dad never cried." Cole said nothing because the sentence contained everything it needed to contain. "I'm going to be okay," Sadie said, not performing it, stating it with the considered certainty of someone who has taken an accurate inventory of the available evidence and drawn a reasonable conclusion. "I think I always was going to be okay. I just needed the situation around me to change." She looked at Cole steadily. "You changed it. You changed it," Cole said. "You came to my yard and told me things you didn't have to tell anyone." She considered this. "I told you because you came for the dog," she said. "I keep coming back to that. My dad saw the dog as a thing to be used. You saw him as—" She paused, looking for the precise word, and then, as somebody. Cole looked at Diesel. Diesel looked back at him with the clear, patient attention of an animal entirely comfortable being looked at because it had nothing to conceal. "He is somebody," Cole said. "Diane Hollis arrived from Phoenix at 2 in the afternoon. She was 41, tall and auburn-haired with the kind of composed, deliberate presence that read immediately as someone who had navigated difficulty before and had organized themselves around it, rather than being organized by it. She wore a plain gray shirt and dark jeans, and the expression of a woman who had spent the 4-hour drive from Phoenix preparing for what she was arriving at, which meant she arrived not with the unsteadiness of shock, but with the grounded readiness of someone who had already processed the first stage of what this was. She found Cole in the hospital corridor outside Sadie's room, standing with Diesel at his side, and she stopped in front of him and looked at him for a moment with the evaluating attention of a person taking in the full dimensions of what she owed. Then she extended her hand. Cole shook it. Her grip was firm and brief and entirely without performance, the handshake of someone who meant it without needing to elaborate on the meaning. "Walt Greer told me what happened," she said. "All of it, from the beginning." She held his gaze with the directness of someone who had decided that directness was the only appropriate register for this conversation. "I've been trying to think of something to say that wouldn't sound insufficient." "You don't need to say anything," Cole said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to anyway." A brief pause. "Carol was my older sister. She was the careful one, the thorough one, the one who understood that doing the right thing sometimes cost more than you budgeted for, and did it anyway." She looked at the closed door of Sadie's room. "I should have been in closer contact. I should have paid more attention to the small things Carol wasn't saying in the last year of her life. She looked back at Cole. I can't fix that. I can make sure Sadie has what she needs from here forward. A pause. And I can tell you that because of what you did last night. That's still an option. Cole received this without deflection. She's strong, he said. Sadie, whatever you think she's gonna need, she'll meet you more than halfway. Diane looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted in the way expressions shifted when a person had been given information that reorganized their understanding of a situation. She told me on the phone this morning, Diane said, that a man with a dog taught her that someone could show up without being asked. She paused. She said it like it was a new concept. Cole said nothing. I intend for it to stop being new, Diane said. She went into Sadie's room, and Cole stood in the corridor with Diesel and listened to the muffled sound of a reunion happening through a closed door, and understood that certain things resolved themselves in ways that required neither his presence nor his management, and that this was one of them. The Copper Ridge Transit Station operated out of a low concrete building on the south end of Main Street, with 4 plastic benches in the waiting area, and a departure board that was updated manually, and was therefore occasionally philosophically out of sync with actual departures. The morning bus to Las Vegas with a connection to Phoenix left at 8:15. Cole arrived at 7:55 with Diesel on the dark green lead. Diane was already there, standing near the luggage rack with 2 bags and the organized, practical readiness of someone who had spent the night in the county's one motel and was prepared to move. She acknowledged Cole with a nod that communicated everything a longer exchange would have required more words to convey. Sadie came out of the waiting area when she heard the gravel under Cole's boots. She was wearing clean clothes. Diane had brought a bag from Phoenix, and her hair was pulled back neatly, and the smoke was gone from her face and her hands, and she looked in the morning light of a desert town. She was about to leave like someone in the process of becoming a slightly different version of herself than the one she had been the week before. Not transformed. Transformation was a word for stories that moved in larger arcs than people actually lived, but incremented forward by experience in the way that all genuine experience incremented a person who paid attention to it. She walked to Diesel first. She crouched in front of the shepherd and put her arms around his neck with careful, deliberate affection, not gripping, not clinging, but holding the way you held something you were about to let go of on purpose because the letting go was the correct thing. Diesel pressed his head against her shoulder and stayed there with the patient, generous stillness of an animal that understood what was being asked of it. She stayed like that for a long moment. Then she stood and looked at Cole. He's gonna be the best dog, she said. Whatever you do with him, whatever you build together, he's going to be everything. She said it with the certainty of someone who had been paying close attention to the evidence and had no remaining doubt about the conclusion. Then, without dropping his gaze, "And you're going to let him?" Cole looked at her. "You know what I mean," she said. "You've been treating yourself like you used to deserve something good and don't anymore." She said it the way children sometimes said things that adults had spent considerable effort not saying, without the apparatus of social hesitation, because social hesitation was a skill she hadn't yet fully acquired, and in this instance had no use for. Diesel doesn't think that. I watched him for 12 days through my dad's fence when I could manage it. Her voice was even and clear. He picked you. Cole was quiet for a moment. He saved me, Sadie said. And I think you letting him was the same as you saving yourself. She paused. My mom's letter said that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who show up without being asked. She held Cole's gaze. You showed up. The bus made the sound of a bus preparing to receive passengers. Diane put her hand briefly on Sadie's shoulder, and Sadie turned and Cole watched them board Diane first. Then Sadie, who paused at the top of the steps and looked back once, and then went through the door. Cole stood in the thin morning light of the Copper Ridge Transit Station until the bus had completed its turn onto Main Street, and its taillights had diminished to 2 red points heading south, and then disappeared entirely into the desert that took everything that passed through it and kept none of it. Diesel sat beside him and watched the road. Greer came to Sagebrush Lane on a Thursday evening 10 days after the fire. The legal structure of Boyd Crane's situation had progressed with the methodical grinding efficiency of county prosecution that had its evidence organized and its documentation in order. Garrett Finch had been identified and was under active investigation by the state attorney's office. The Route 93 accident file had been formally reopened and transferred to a division with the authority to pursue it at the level it required. The stolen equipment had been cataloged and return proceedings initiated with the originating counties. The USB drive's contents, recovered and forensically verified, had produced documentation sufficient to support every charge and to initiate several new lines of inquiry. Carol Hollis's careful, thorough, costly work was being used precisely as she had intended it to be used. Cole had been told all of this by Greer in measured installments over the preceding 10 days, and he had received each installment with the same quality of attention with which he received everything fully present, not asking more than was being offered, understanding that some things moved at the pace they moved, and that impatience had no productive function in relation to them. He was in the yard with Diesel when Greer arrived, running a tracking exercise across the back section of the lot where Cole had laid scent markers in the early morning before the heat built. Diesel was working them with the precise economical efficiency that had been present in his training from the beginning, and that had developed over 10 days of consistent practice into something sharper and more assured, the confidence of an animal who was no longer recovering his training but actively extending it. Greer stood at the gate and watched for a moment before speaking. Carson City called yesterday, he said. About the registration. Cole straightened from the crouch he'd been in watching Diesel work the final marker. They're formally releasing the K-9 placement given the circumstances, Greer said. Program director reviewed the file. Their assessment is that the training investment is best honored by placement with a qualified handler in an active capacity rather than return to a facility environment after what the dog went through. He paused. They asked me who found him. I told them. Cole looked at Diesel, who had completed the exercise and was making his way back across the yard at an easy trot tail up the expression of an animal that had done a thing correctly and knew it. There's something else, Greer said. He came through the gate and stopped a few feet from Cole, hands in his pockets with the composure he adopted when he was about to say something he had prepared rather than improvised. I've been thinking about what we're dealing with in this county. Animals chained in yards when families run out of options. Working dogs treated like equipment. People who never learned the first thing about how a dog actually functions, not because they're cruel necessarily, but because nobody taught them. He looked at Cole steadily. I've been thinking about a program. Small. Community-based. education temporary foster placement for animals in crisis situations, basic handling instruction. He paused. Nothing that requires a large organization or a budget line I don't have. Just someone who understands the difference between authority and cruelty and can demonstrate it. Cole said nothing. You built something with that dog in 10 days that most handlers don't build in 6 months, Greer said. Not because of technique, though. The technique is right. Because of the approach. He looked at Diesel, who had arrived at Cole's side and was now watching Greer with the interested, unalarmed attention of a dog assessing a familiar presence. The people in this county who are doing it wrong, most of them aren't doing it wrong on purpose. They're doing it the way they were taught, or the way they assumed, or the way nobody ever thought to question. He held Cole's gaze. You could change that. Cole looked at the yard, at the mesquite tree's morning shadow falling long and blue-gray across the gravel, at the canvas mat and the water bowl, and the simple, functional architecture of what had been built here over the preceding weeks. At Diesel, standing at his left side with his ears at the easy angle of an animal, entirely at home in the place it occupied. He thought about Sadie's voice in the hospital room. You saw him as somebody. He thought about Carol Hollis's USB drive in its careful foam lining prepared for an absence. Its maker had hoped wouldn't come and had prepared for anyway because hope and preparation were not opposites. They were, in fact, the same thing viewed from different angles. Hope that looked honestly at risk and acted anyway. He thought about Rex, not with the weight that thought usually carried, not with the compression and the dark and the 22-month arithmetic of survival. With something that had begun incrementally, and without ceremony to feel like something other than wound. Memory, maybe. The honest, bearable kind. Rex had moved forward at that threshold, because moving forward was what Rex had been in his deepest nature, designed and trained and inclined to do. Cole had always known this at the level of thought. The part of him that hadn't known it was the part that lived below, knowing where guilt built its architecture and refused the light, and that part had needed something that arguments and years of distance had not been able to provide. It had needed evidence. It had needed a dog that didn't quit, and a girl who showed up to a stranger's yard with the truth, and a fire that required him to find out, at the only moment it mattered, that he was still capable of moving toward the thing instead of away from it. He had his evidence now. What would you call it? Cole said. Greer allowed himself the smallest adjustment at the corner of his mouth. Copper Ridge Companion Care Initiative, he said. Provisional title. Open to input. It's fine, Cole said. There's a community center on Elm with meeting space available on Thursday evenings, Greer said. I've already spoken with 3 ranching families who have expressed interest, and Mrs. Cross from your block has offered to coordinate outreach. Cole looked toward the fence line where Mrs. Adeline Cross's wind chimes were moving in the morning's thin early breeze. She didn't mention it, Cole said. She mentioned it to me, Greer said. She said she'd been waiting to see whether you'd figure it out on your own or need a push. He paused. She voted for a push. Cole exhaled not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, but the compound expression of a man whose carefully maintained interior reserve had developed an unexpected small opening and was allowing something through it. He bent and ran his hand along Diesel's back in the unhurried, complete way, shoulder to hip, the full stroke, and the shepherd leaned fractionally into the contact, the subtle weight of an animal that was in the right place and knew it. "Thursday evening?" Cole said. 7 o'clock, Greer said. He nodded once more, then turned and walked back down the drive. The gravel announcing his departure, the same way it had announced his arrival. And then the sound of his engine faded west, and Sagebrush Lane returned to the late afternoon quiet of a desert town that was in its small and imperfect way, still trying to be something worth the effort. He woke before the alarm in the dark just before first light, and lay still for a moment listening to the desert outside the window, the silence that preceded the day in that country before the heat had built, and the town had started its engines, and the world had reassembled itself into the version that required things from people. Diesel was at the foot of the bed. Cole could hear his breathing slow and even and complete, the breathing of an animal genuinely at rest. Paws occasionally shifting against the canvas mat in the subtle telling movements of canine sleep. Running in those dreams, most likely. Free open ground and the full extension of that working line stride that had carried them both out of a burning building and into the desert morning 100 times in the weeks since. Cole had noticed over the past 10 days that his own sleep had changed. Not dramatically. Sleep didn't change dramatically. It changed the way trust changed in increments that only became visible when you look back over enough of them. But the nights were longer now. The 3 a.m. wakings less frequent. And when the threshold memory came, as it still came, as he expected it would continue to come for the foreseeable future, it arrived differently than before, not with the sharp, intrusive insistence of unfinished business, more like the settled, complete presence of something that had been understood and could now simply exist as what it was. The true account of a dog that had done what it was built to do, and had done it completely without hesitation, without asking to be released from the obligation of its own nature. Rex had moved forward at that threshold, because moving forward was Rex. It was the fullest expression of everything that dog had been from the first day of training to the last moment of his life. He had not been failed. He had been exactly himself, at exactly the moment he was supposed to be, and Cole had been there to see it. That was not a wound. That was a legacy. He got up dressed in the dark and carried his boots to the back door to put them on there. A habit from years of shared quarters of not waking people who needed their sleep. Diesel lifted his head when Cole moved, and Cole made a small sound, a low consonant that wasn't quite a word, and the shepherd rose from the mat with the fluid, unhurried ease of an animal waking into its own strength. They went out the back door into the pre-dawn dark. The sky above Copper Ridge held the deep blue that preceded first light. Not yet gray, not yet touched by the orange that came with sunrise, still keeping the last quality of true night along the western horizon, while the east began its slow incremental brightening. The desert air was cool at this hour, genuinely cool. Not relatively cool, the kind of temperature that reminded the body that temperature was a spectrum, and this end of it still existed. Cole walked to the gate at the back of the yard, unlatched it and swung it open onto the expanse of scrubland that extended westward from the residential edge of Copper Ridge into the open desert beyond. He unclipped the lead from Diesel's collar. He made a single gesture with his right hand, flat palm outward, the release signal they had developed in training without Cole having consciously designed it the way the best signals developed out of repetition. Finding its natural form, Diesel went, not explosively, not with the frantic release of compression, but with the immediate, powerful, fully committed extension of an animal that knew what its body was for and was using it. His stride opened in 3 beats from the gate to the scrubland. The German Shepherd gait at its best, ground covering and efficient, and entirely self-contained. His coat catching the first gray light along its surface, his ears back and his tail level in the aerodynamic configuration of real speed. He ran in the wide, sweeping arcs that working line shepherds ran. When given open ground, not random, not frantic, but patterned in the way that spoke of a dog expressing its fundamental orientation towards space, which was to understand it, to move through it with awareness rather than abandon to be fully present in it. He had been chained within a radius of 6 feet for months. Now the radius was everything. Cole walked forward through the gate and onto the desert floor and let his stride open as well. Not running, not yet. And then, yes, running the boots. Finding the ground with the rhythm that came back to a body that had once known it well, and had not entirely lost it in the intervening years of deliberate stillness. He ran with his face into the east, into the direction of the developing light, into the growing separation between the black of the western sky and the rose gold assembling itself above the horizon line ahead of him. And the desert came at him with the wholeness it offered to things that move through it, rather than standing still waiting for it to resolve. Diesel circled back from a wide arc and found him falling into stride at his left side, not so close as to constrain, not so far as to lose the thread of proximity. And they ran together in the way that two things ran when they were not pursuing each other, and not racing and not performing for any audience, but simply moving in the same direction at the same time, because that direction was the one both of them had chosen. The mesquite and the sage threw blue-purple shadows behind them, and Cole ran into it with his eyes forward, and Diesel running at his left, and the light coming at them both without distinction, falling on the man and the dog with the same indifferent, complete abundance that it fell on everything else in that landscape. No chain, no threshold holding its question in the dark, no arithmetic of survival that counted one life against another and always came up short. Just the ground and the light and the dog and the direction which was forward, which was the only direction worth the name, which was the one Rex had known better than anyone and had pointed Cole toward one last time from the far side of a threshold that Cole was now finally all the way through. He ran until the town was a collection of low shapes behind him, and the desert was everything ahead of him, and Diesel was a moving shape at the edge of his vision, circling back, always circling back. And the morning was fully arrived, enormous and unhurried and unambiguously itself, the way mornings were in places that didn't soften things, but offered them instead as they were in full light, available to anyone willing to look. Cole slowed to a walk. Diesel came alongside him, breathing hard and even, and matched his pace without instruction. They walked side by side across ground that the early light was turning from shadow to substance, two figures moving west against the brightening sky, the shepherd close enough that Cole could feel the warmth radiating from that black and tan coat, the heat of work, of healthy exertion of an animal fully alive and fully itself in the open world. Cole reached down and rested his hand on the dog's back as they walked, the way you rested a hand on the shoulder of someone you were walking with, not directing, not restraining, just acknowledging the company, the shared ground, the forward direction they had chosen together, without negotiating it. Diesel leaned lightly into the touch. They walked west together into the widening day, and the desert held them both without judgment. And the morning kept coming the way mornings did, indifferent to whether you were ready, generous with its light regardless. Cole was ready.